What happens when a seasoned television host decides to humiliate a guest on live television, thinking they're dealing with just another political appointee? What they don't realize is that sometimes the person sitting across from you has walked through fires that would break most people, and their quiet strength runs deeper than any camera can capture. This is the story of a moment that lasted less than 5 minutes, but changed the trajectory of an entire career, and how one woman's response to public mockery became a masterclass in grace under pressure that millions still talk about today. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The CNN newsroom buzzed with its usual controlled chaos on that Tuesday evening in March. Banks of monitors displayed breaking news feeds from around the globe, while producers scurried between desks, adjusting graphics and confirming guest schedules. The familiar red and blue set of prime-time politics gleamed under studio lights that had witnessed countless heated debates, career-defining moments, and the occasional political meltdown that would trend on social media for weeks. Marcus Sterling had occupied the anchor chair for nearly 12 years, building a reputation as one of television's most formidable interviewers. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit immaculate, and his confidence bordered on arrogance. Tonight's show promised to be particularly contentious, with several high-profile guests scheduled to discuss the administration's latest policy proposals. Behind the cameras, associate producer Jennifer Hayes checked her clipboard for the third time. The evening's lineup included a former ambassador, 2 senators, and Tricia Whitmore, the newly confirmed Attorney General, who had been making headlines not for her legal expertise, but for what critics called her unconventional background. Jennifer had done her research on Whitmore, and something about the woman's story didn't sit right with the narrative being pushed by the network's research team. Marcus adjusted his earpiece as the makeup artist applied a final touch of powder to his forehead. He'd already reviewed his notes on Whitmore, though he barely needed them. In his mind, this was going to be straightforward. A small-town lawyer who'd somehow managed to climb the political ladder despite what his researchers had characterized as a series of professional setbacks. The plan was simple: expose her inexperience, highlight her failures, and demonstrate why she was unfit for such a crucial position. What Marcus didn't know was that those professional setbacks told a very different story than what appeared. In his briefing notes, Patricia Whitmore sat in the green room, her hands folded calmly in her lap. At 52, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that had been forged through decades of adversity. Her navy blazer was well-tailored but not expensive, her grey hair styled simply, and her only jewelry was a small silver cross necklace that she unconsciously touched when nervous. She'd been through dozens of interviews since her nomination, and each one felt like walking through a minefield where any step could trigger an explosion of controversy. The Green Room's television displayed the current segment, where Marcus was grilling a senator about healthcare policy with his trademark intensity. Patricia watched, studying his technique, noting how he interrupted, how he framed his questions to box in his guests, how he used silence as a weapon. She'd faced hostile courtrooms before, but television was a different battlefield entirely. Ms. Whitmore, a young production assistant, appeared at the door. "You're on in 3 minutes." Patricia nodded, standing with the practiced composure of someone who'd learned to mask her emotions. She thought briefly of her daughter Emma, now 28, and working as a public defender in Chicago. Emma had called that morning, worried about the interview. "Mom, just remember who you are," she'd said. "Don't let them make you into someone you're not." The walk from the green room to the studio felt longer than usual. Patricia had done this journey numerous times over the past month, but tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that something significant was about to happen. Camera operators adjusted their positions, sound technicians checked levels one final time, and the floor director began his countdown. Marcus didn't bother to stand when Patricia entered the studio. He barely looked up from his notes as she took her seat across from him, the imposing desk creating a physical barrier between them. The lighting had been adjusted to be particularly harsh on her side of the set, a subtle but effective technique to make guests appear less polished, more vulnerable. 30 seconds, called the floor director. Marcus finally glanced at Patricia, offering the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Ready for this, General? The title wasn't meant as a sign of respect. His tone made it clear he considered it unearned. Patricia met his gaze steadily. Always. The red light on camera 1 flickered to life, and Marcus transformed into his on-air persona. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention, his posture perfect, his expression serious but not unfriendly. Good evening, I'm Marcus Sterling, and you're watching Prime Time Politics. Tonight, we're joined by Attorney General Patricia Whitmore, who's been on the job for exactly 47 days. General Whitmore, thank you for being here. Thank you for having me, Marcus. The first few questions were routine, the kind of softballs that allowed both host and guest to settle into the rhythm of the interview. Patricia answered with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that every word would be scrutinized, analyzed, and potentially weaponized. She spoke about the Justice Department's priorities, about ongoing initiatives, about her commitment to public service. But Marcus was just warming up. Let's talk about your background, he said, leaning back in his chair with the casual confidence of a predator circling its prey. You've had what some might call an interesting career path. Small-town lawyer, a few failed businesses, some legal troubles of your own. Help our viewers understand how that qualifies you to be the nation's top law enforcement officer. The question was designed to wound, to force Patricia into a defensive position where she'd have to justify her entire life history. In the control room, Jennifer Hayes winced. She'd tried to warn the producers that this line of attack might backfire, but her concerns had been dismissed. Patricia's expression didn't change. She'd been expecting this moment since her nomination was announced. Marcus, I think there's value in having leadership that understands what it's like to face real challenges, to experience setbacks, and to rebuild. My path hasn't been conventional, but it's been authentic. Authentic, Marcus repeated, as if the word tasted bitter. Let's examine that authenticity. Your law practice in Millfield, Ohio, closed after 6 years. Your consulting firm lasted 18 months. Your non-profit organization for veterans legal aid shut down amid questions about financial management. That's a lot of failure for someone now tasked with managing the entire federal justice system. The studio fell silent except for the low hum of equipment. Camera operators instinctively adjusted their shots, sensing that something was building. Patricia sat perfectly still, her hands remaining folded, her expression unchanging. Marcus, she said quietly, you've done your research, but research and understanding are two very different things. Enlighten us, Marcus shot back, his tone dripping with condescension. Help us understand how a track record of business failures qualifies you for this position. Because frankly, many Americans are wondering if you're in over your head. It was the kind of moment that defined careers. The studio audience, though instructed to remain silent, collectively held its breath. In living rooms across the country, viewers leaned forward, some cringing at the obvious ambush, others waiting to see how Patricia would respond to such direct humiliation. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media, analyzed by political commentators, and studied in journalism schools as either a masterclass in aggressive interviewing or a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming you know someone's story. Patricia's response began not with words, but with a slight, almost imperceptible change in her posture. She straightened just a fraction, and for the first time since sitting down, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "Marcus, you mentioned my law practice in Millfield. You're right that it closed after 6 years. What you didn't mention is why." Her voice remained calm, conversational, but there was something new in it now, a quiet strength that hadn't been there moments before. "I'm sure you'll tell us," Marcus said, his tone suggesting he was indulging a child. "I will. My practice specialized in family law, particularly helping women escape domestic violence situations. For 6 years, I worked 18-hour days, often for clients who couldn't pay, because I believed everyone deserved legal representation, regardless of their financial situation. The practice closed because I spent more time on pro bono work than paying clients. I made a choice to prioritize justice over profit." The first crack in Marcus's confidence appeared as a slight tightening around his eyes. In the control room, Jennifer Hayes was frantically pulling up additional research files, realizing that their briefing materials had missed crucial context. "That's admirable, but—" Marcus began, but Patricia continued. "You mentioned my consulting firm. 18 months, you said. Again, you're technically correct. What you didn't mention is that during those 18 months, I helped 12 small municipalities restructure their legal departments to better serve rural communities. The firm closed because I accepted a position as a federal prosecutor, not because it failed." Marcus's research team was scrambling now, feeding corrections through his earpiece, but he was too committed to his attack to back down gracefully. "And the non-profit," he pressed, though his voice had lost some of its earlier swagger. "The Veterans Legal Aid Foundation," Patricia said, and for the first time, her voice carried a note of emotion. "It closed not because of financial mismanagement, but because I was spending 14 hours a day running it while serving as a federal prosecutor. I had to choose between my government service and the non-profit. The foundation successfully helped over 2,000 veterans resolve legal issues related to their benefits, housing, and employment rights. When I stepped down, other organizations absorbed our caseload and continued the work. The studio had become completely quiet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Camera operators had stopped adjusting their equipment. Sound technicians were leaning forward in their booths. Even the floor director had paused his usual pacing to listen. But Patricia wasn't finished. "Marcus, you said Americans are wondering if I'm in over my head. Let me tell you about being in over my head. Being in over my head was representing a woman whose husband had broken her arm in 3 places, knowing that if I made one procedural mistake, she'd go back to him and might not survive. Being in over my head was prosecuting a case against a corrupt sheriff who'd been taking bribes from drug dealers while rural communities suffered, knowing that failure meant more families would be destroyed." She paused, touching that silver cross at her throat. Being in over my head was sitting in a military hospital with a veteran who'd been waiting 18 months for disability benefits he'd earned by losing his leg in Afghanistan, trying to explain why the system had failed him again. Every single day of my career, I've been in over my head because the stakes were always higher than I was comfortable with. But that's the point, isn't it? If we're only willing to take on challenges we're certain we can handle, we're not really serving anyone but ourselves. Marcus had gone completely still. For 12 years, he'd built his reputation on his ability to control interviews, to stay one step ahead of his guests, to maintain the upper hand through preparation and aggression. But he was witnessing something he'd never encountered before. Someone who was using his attack as a platform not to defend herself, but to reveal who she really was. "General Whitmore," he began, but his voice had lost its edge. "I know what you see when you look at me," Patricia continued, and now her voice carried the authority of someone who'd fought real battles and won some of them. "You see a small-town lawyer who stumbled upward through a series of lucky breaks, but I want to tell you what I see when I look in the mirror." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "I see someone who's spent 30 years fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. I see someone who's made mistakes, learned from them, and kept fighting. I see someone who understands that justice isn't an abstract concept debated. In law schools, it's something that happens or doesn't happen in courtrooms and communities every single day." The control room was in chaos. Producers were shouting instructions, trying to figure out how to handle what had become less an interview than a revelation. Social media was already exploding with clips of Patricia's response, but the full impact was still building. "You want to know what qualifies me for this position?" Patricia asked, though it was clear the question was rhetorical. "It's not my resume, Marcus. It's the fact that every person I've represented, every case I've prosecuted, every veteran I've helped, they all taught me that the law isn't about winning or losing. It's about ensuring that power serves justice, not the other way around." Marcus made one last attempt to regain control of the interview. "That's a beautiful sentiment, General. But sentiment doesn't run the Justice Department. Experience does. Leadership does." Patricia nodded slowly, as if she'd been waiting for exactly this response. "You're absolutely right. Leadership does matter. Let me tell you about leadership, Marcus. Real leadership isn't about never failing. It's about getting back up, learning from your mistakes, and doing better next time. Real leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions and listening to people who know more than you do." She paused, and in that pause, something shifted in the studio. The hostile energy that had dominated the interview began to transform into something else. Entirely, "You know what I learned in that small law practice that supposedly failed? I learned that justice delayed is justice denied. I learned that sometimes the most important victories happen in cases nobody else cares about. I learned that the law is only as strong as our commitment to applying it fairly, regardless of someone's wealth, status, or connections." Marcus was no longer trying to interrupt. Something in Patricia's voice, in her presence, had commanded the space in a way he'd never experienced from a guest. "In my consulting work, I learned that rural communities face unique challenges in accessing legal services. I learned that small municipalities often lack the resources to provide adequate legal representation for their citizens. I learned that innovation and creativity matter more than tradition when you're trying to solve real problems." She looked directly into the camera now, speaking not to Marcus, but to the millions of viewers watching. "And in my work with veterans, I learned about sacrifice, real sacrifice. I met men and women who'd given everything for their country and then come home to navigate a bureaucratic maze that seemed designed to wear them down until they gave up. I learned that serving your country doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It begins." The studio was completely silent now. Even the ambient noise of the newsroom beyond the set seemed to have faded. Patricia's voice was the only sound, calm and steady and completely unshakable. "So, when you ask what qualifies me for this position, Marcus, here's my answer. I've spent 3 decades learning that the justice system only works when it works for everyone. I've seen what happens when people lose faith in the law, when they believe the system is rigged against them, when they stop believing that truth and fairness matter." She leaned back in her chair, her hands still folded, her expression serene. "I've also seen what happens when someone fights for them, when someone refuses to give up, when someone remembers that every case, every decision, every action taken by the Justice Department affects real people living real lives in real communities across this country. Marcus finally found his voice, though it was notably quieter than it had been throughout the interview. General Whitmore, we're almost out of time, but I have to ask, do you have any regrets about the path that led you here? For the first time since the interview began, Patricia smiled. Not the polite, media-trained smile of a politician, but something genuine and warm. Marcus, if I'd known at 22 what I know now, I probably would have made different choices. I might have been more strategic, more careful about protecting my reputation, more focused on building a conventional career path. But you know, what? Those failures you mentioned, those setbacks, those moments when I was definitely in over my head, they taught me things I never could have learned any other way. She paused, touching her necklace again. They taught me humility. They taught me empathy. They taught me that resilience isn't about avoiding failure. It's about how you respond when failure finds you anyway. And most importantly, they taught me that the most meaningful work often happens in the spaces between success and failure, where people are just trying to do the right thing even when it's difficult. Marcus nodded slowly, and for the first time in the interview, his expression held something like respect. Attorney General Patricia Whitmore, thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you, Marcus. It's been illuminating. As the cameras stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, something extraordinary had just happened. What had begun as an ambush interview designed to expose and humiliate had transformed into something entirely different. A masterclass in grace under pressure, a demonstration of strength that had nothing to do with never falling down and everything to do with how you get back up. In the control room, Jennifer Hayes was staring at her monitors in amazement. The phones were already ringing non-stop, and social media was exploding with responses to Patricia's performance. But more than that, something had shifted in the room itself. Crew members who'd been through thousands of interviews were looking at each other with expressions of genuine surprise. Marcus remained in his chair for several minutes after Patricia had left the studio, staring at his notes, trying to understand what had just happened. He'd come prepared for a routine political takedown, the kind of aggressive interview that had built his career. Instead, he'd encountered something he'd never faced before. Someone who was stronger than his attacks, who had used his hostility as a platform to reveal not weakness, but profound strength. Meanwhile, Patricia walked through the CNN building's corridors with the same calm dignity she'd maintained throughout the interview. But inside, she was processing what had just occurred. For the first time in months of brutal confirmation hearings and hostile interviews, she'd been able to tell her actual story instead of defending against distortions of it. The young production assistant who'd escorted her to the studio was waiting by the elevator. "Ms. Whitmore, I just wanted to say, that was incredible. My mom's a single mother who works 2 jobs, and sometimes she talks about feeling like she's failing because she can't do everything perfectly. I think she needs to see this." Patricia smiled, the first completely genuine expression she'd allowed herself all day. "What's your mom's name?" "Sarah. Sarah Chen." "Tell Sarah that perfection is overrated. Tell her that showing up and doing your best, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, that's what courage looks like." As the elevator doors closed behind her, Patricia allowed herself a moment to breathe. She had no idea that upstairs, in editing rooms and control rooms across the country, her words were already being clipped, shared, and reshared. She had no idea that her response to Marcus Sterling's attack would be watched by millions of people around the world, or that it would become a defining moment not just in her own career, but in conversations about leadership, resilience, and what it really means to serve. But perhaps most importantly, she had no idea that in Chicago, a young public defender named Emma Whitmore was watching the interview with tears in her eyes, finally understanding where her own strength had come from and feeling proud to be her mother's daughter. The interview was over, but the story was just beginning. The aftermath of the interview hit social media like a digital tsunami. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, clips of Patricia's response were spreading across Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok with unprecedented velocity. The hashtag #MyRealLeadership began trending globally, accompanied by a flood of personal stories from viewers who saw their own struggles reflected in Patricia's journey. But while the internet celebrated what many were calling the most powerful interview response in recent memory, behind the scenes at CNN, a very different conversation was taking place. Marcus Sterling sat in his office, door closed, staring at the flood of messages pouring into his phone. Some praised his aggressive questioning, calling it exactly the kind of journalism the country needed. But far more were critical, and their words stung with unexpected precision. Watching you try to tear down someone who spent their life building others up was painful, read one tweet that had been retweeted thousands of times. You look like a man who's never had to fight for anything trying to humiliate someone, who's fought for everything. Marcus had built his career on being the smartest person in the room, the one who asked the questions others were afraid to ask. But tonight, for the first time in years, he felt like he'd been outclassed, not by superior preparation or political savvy, but by something far more fundamental: authentic human experience. 3 floors below Marcus's office, Jennifer Hayes was experiencing her own revelation. She'd spent the last 2 hours digging deeper into Patricia Whitmore's background, following threads that the original research team had either missed or deliberately ignored. What she was finding painted a picture so different from the briefing materials that she wondered if she was researching the same person. The law practice in Millfield, Ohio, that had supposedly failed after 6 years, had actually been recognized by the Ohio State Bar Association for its innovative approach to providing legal services to underserved communities. During its 6 years of operation, Patricia had personally handled over 800 cases, the majority involving domestic violence victims, child custody disputes, and elderly clients facing financial exploitation. Jennifer found archived local newspaper articles describing how Patricia had often worked without payment, accepting chickens, homemade preserves, and handwritten thank you notes instead of legal fees. One article from 2008 described how she'd mortgaged her own home to keep the practice open during the financial crisis, ensuring that her clients wouldn't lose representation during their most vulnerable moments. The consulting firm's 18-month lifespan looked very different when viewed in context. Patricia had been recruited by the Department of Justice to serve as a federal prosecutor while her consulting business was actually expanding. She'd chosen public service over private profit, a decision that cost her financially but allowed her to prosecute major corruption cases that had cleaned up entire judicial districts. Most revealing of all was the story behind the Veterans Legal Aid Foundation. Jennifer discovered that Patricia had founded the organization after her younger brother Daniel, a Marine veteran, had committed suicide while waiting for disability benefits that were delayed by bureaucratic red tape. The foundation had processed over 3,000 cases in its 3 years of operation, maintaining a 94% success rate in resolving veterans' legal issues. But Patricia had closed the foundation not because of financial problems, but because she'd been offered the opportunity to join a congressional task force on veterans' affairs. She'd calculated that she could help more veterans by influencing, policy at the federal level than by continuing to fight individual cases one at a time. Jennifer stared at her computer screen, feeling a growing sense of unease about her own industry. Every failure in Patricia's background was actually evidence of someone who consistently chose service over self-interest, who had sacrificed financial stability and career advancement to help people who couldn't help themselves. Meanwhile, across the country in Chicago, Emma Whitmore was fielding phone calls from reporters who'd tracked down her connection to the new Attorney General. As a public defender, Emma had deliberately kept a low profile, but tonight's interview had thrust her into an unwanted spotlight. "Ms. Whitmore, can you comment on your mother's performance tonight?" asked the third journalist who'd called in the past hour. Emma looked out the window of her modest apartment, where she could see the lights of the Cook County Jail, where many of her clients were housed. "My mother did what she's always done," she said quietly. "She told the truth." "Can you elaborate on that?" Emma thought about the years she'd watched her mother struggle, the nights Patricia had fallen asleep at the kitchen table while working on cases, the times they'd eaten peanut butter sandwiches for dinner because Patricia had again prioritized a client's needs over their own financial stability. "My mother taught me that success isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you give. Every decision she's made, every job she's taken or left, every sacrifice she's endured, it's all been about serving something larger than herself." The reporter pressed for more details, but Emma had learned from her mother the power of saying exactly what needed to be said, and nothing more. After ending the call, she pulled up the interview on her laptop and watched it again, this time focusing not on her mother's words, but on her presence, the way she'd remained completely centered, even under attack. Emma had always known her mother was strong, but seeing her on that stage, transforming hostility into opportunity, had revealed something Emma was only now beginning to understand. Her mother's apparent failures weren't failures at all. They were the foundation of a kind of strength that couldn't be taught in any school or learned from any book. Back in New York, Marcus Sterling was discovering that his problems extended far beyond social media criticism. Network executives had been fielding calls all evening from advertisers concerned about being associated with what many were characterizing as an unfair attack on a public servant. More troubling for Marcus personally were the calls from journalistic colleagues questioning whether he'd crossed a line from aggressive interviewing into something closer to character assassination. At home, in his Manhattan penthouse, Marcus poured himself a scotch and tried to process what had gone wrong. He'd conducted the interview exactly as he'd planned, using the same techniques that had made him one of television's most respected political journalists. His questions had been direct, his preparation thorough, his approach uncompromising. But watching the replay, Marcus could see something he'd missed in the moment. While he'd been attacking Patricia's resume, she'd been revealing her character. While he'd been trying to expose her weaknesses, she'd been demonstrating her strengths. Most unsettling of all, while he'd been attempting to humiliate her, she'd somehow managed to elevate not just herself, but the entire conversation. Marcus thought about his own career path, the prestigious journalism school, the internships at major networks, the careful cultivation of sources and relationships that had led to his current position. He'd never failed at anything significant, never had to rebuild from nothing, never faced the kind of adversity that had shaped Patricia's perspective. For the first time in his professional life, Marcus wondered if his greatest strength, his ability to maintain distance and objectivity, might also be a fundamental limitation. How could someone who'd never really struggled understand the strength that comes from overcoming struggle? The question gnawed at him as he tried to sleep, and by morning it had crystallized into something approaching self-awareness. Marcus had spent 12 years interviewing people about their failures and successes, but he'd never really understood the difference between the two. 3 time zones away, Patricia Whitmore was experiencing her own sleepless night, but for very different reasons. The interview had accomplished something she hadn't expected. It had forced her to articulate not just her qualifications for the position, but her fundamental philosophy about service and leadership. Lying in her hotel room, Patricia thought about the path that had brought her to this moment, every choice she'd made, every sacrifice she'd endured, every time she'd chosen duty over personal advancement. It had all led to this opportunity to serve at the highest level of government. But the interview had also reminded her of the cost of that path. The financial struggles, the relationships that had suffered because of her commitment to her work, the personal dreams she'd deferred or abandoned entirely. Patricia had no illusions about the sacrifices public service required, but tonight had forced her to confront whether those sacrifices had been worth it. The answer came to her as she remembered something that hadn't made it into the interview. During her time as a federal prosecutor, she'd worked on a case involving a human trafficking ring that had been operating across state lines. The investigation had taken 2 years, requiring her to work 16-hour days and miss countless family dinners and school events. But when they'd finally arrested the ringleaders and rescued 43 victims, including 12 children, Patricia had stood in the courthouse lobby and watched families reunited with loved ones they'd thought they'd lost forever. One mother, whose daughter had been missing for 8 months, had grabbed Patricia's hands and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up." That moment had crystallized everything Patricia believed about public service. The work wasn't about recognition or advancement or building impressive resumes. It was about standing between innocent people and those who would harm them, about using whatever power and privilege you possessed to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The interview with Marcus Sterling had been just another version of that same principle. He'd attempted to diminish her by focusing on surface appearances, but she'd responded by revealing the deeper truths that actually mattered. In doing so, she'd demonstrated the same principle she'd tried to embody throughout her career. When someone attacks what you appear to be, respond by showing them who you actually are. As dawn broke over Washington, Patricia finally fell asleep, unaware that her performance the night before had set in motion a series of events that would reshape not just her own career, but the national conversation about leadership and public service. By morning, the interview had been viewed over 15 million times across various platforms. News outlets around the world were analyzing Patricia's response, with many calling it a masterclass in crisis communication. Political science professors were already incorporating clips into their curricula, using it as an example of how to maintain dignity under pressure. But the most significant impact was happening in living rooms and coffee shops across the country, where ordinary people were sharing their own stories of resilience and service. Patricia's words had given permission for people to reframe their own struggles, not as failures, but as foundations for strength. Marcus Sterling arrived at the CNN offices to find his assistant fielding interview requests from media outlets wanting to discuss the previous night's broadcast. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd become the story instead of the storyteller, and not in the way he'd intended. Network executives had scheduled a meeting for that afternoon to discuss the interview and its fallout. Marcus knew his job wasn't in immediate jeopardy. His ratings were too strong and his contract too solid, but he also understood that something fundamental had shifted in how he was perceived both within the industry and by the public. The meeting was led by Sarah Chen, CNN's executive vice president of news programming, a woman Marcus had always respected for her editorial judgment and her ability to navigate the complex politics of television journalism. Sarah had built her career on the principle that journalism's primary obligation was to the truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable or complicated. Marcus, Sarah began, her tone professional but serious, we need to talk about last night. Marcus had prepared for this conversation, but as he sat across from Sarah and two other network executives, he found himself unsure of how to defend an interview that had seemed perfectly appropriate when he'd planned it, but now felt problematic in retrospect. The interview was conducted according to our editorial standards, Marcus said carefully. I asked direct questions about her background and qualifications. Sarah nodded. You did, but the question isn't whether you followed our standards. It's whether our standards are adequate for the kind of journalism we want to practice. She pulled up the interview on her laptop and played several key exchanges. Watch this segment and tell me what you see. Marcus watched himself pressing Patricia about her business failures, saw the way he'd framed his questions to suggest incompetence and poor judgment. But now, with the benefit of hindsight and the context of Patricia's responses, his approach looked different, less like rigorous journalism and more like prosecutorial grandstanding. I see a journalist asking tough questions, Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. I see a journalist who did extensive research into what someone had done but no research into why they'd done it, Sarah replied. You prepared to tear down her resume without understanding the values that shaped her choices. The criticism stung because Marcus recognized its accuracy. He'd approached the interview as an adversarial proceeding rather than an opportunity to understand and illuminate. He'd been so focused on exposing Patricia's vulnerabilities that he'd missed the story that actually mattered, how someone builds strength through adversity rather than in spite of it. What would you have done differently? Asked one of the other executives. Sarah considered the question carefully. I would have asked her about the choices she'd made and why she'd made them. I would have tried to understand the philosophy behind her career path instead of just cataloging its outcomes. I would have remembered that our job isn't to prosecute our guests, it's to help our audience understand them. Marcus felt a familiar defensiveness rising, but forced himself to consider Sarah's words objectively. He'd built his reputation on his ability to ask the questions others avoided, to push past political talking points to reach deeper truths. But the previous night had revealed a blind spot in his approach. He'd become so skilled at attacking surface positions that he'd lost the ability to recognize when someone was operating from a deeper level entirely. The ratings were strong, Marcus offered, though he knew that was hardly the point. The ratings were strong because people recognized they were watching something extraordinary, Sarah replied. But it wasn't extraordinary because of your questions. It was extraordinary because of her responses. She transformed your attack into an opportunity to demonstrate exactly the kind of leadership the country needs to see. The meeting continued for another hour, with Sarah and the other executives making it clear that while Marcus's job was secure, expectations for his future interviews would be different. The network wanted journalism that illuminated rather than just interrogated, that sought understanding rather than just advantage. As Marcus returned to his office, he found himself thinking about Patricia Whitmore in a way he hadn't during their interview. Not as a political target or a career opportunity, but as a person whose life experiences had taught her things he'd never had to learn. That afternoon, Marcus did something he rarely did. He called his own mother, a retired teacher in Ohio who'd spent 40 years working in underfunded public schools. He'd always been proud of her work, but had never really understood the sacrifices it had required until now. "Mom," he said when she answered, "tell me about the times you felt like you were failing." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and gave Marcus insight into a world of quiet heroism he'd somehow missed, despite growing up surrounded by it. His mother spoke about the students she'd taught who came to school hungry, the classroom supplies she'd bought with her own money, The evenings she'd spent tutoring kids whose parents worked multiple jobs and couldn't help with homework. She told him about the year the school's arts program had been cut, and she'd organized a fundraising campaign that kept music and art classes alive through community donations and volunteer teachers. She described the satisfaction of watching struggling students gradually gain confidence, the heartbreak of seeing talented kids whose potential was limited by circumstances beyond their control. "I never thought of myself as changing the world," his mother said. "I just showed up every day and tried to make whatever small difference I could." As Marcus listened, he began to understand something about public service that had eluded him throughout his career. It wasn't about grand gestures or historic achievements. It was about the daily choice to put other people's needs ahead of your own convenience, to persist in difficult work because someone had to do it, to measure success not by personal advancement but by positive impact on others' lives. That evening, Marcus found himself watching Patricia's interview response again, but this time he heard it differently. Her words about being in over your head weren't just political rhetoric. They were the authentic voice of someone who'd chosen to take on challenges larger than herself, because that's what service required. Her description of representing domestic violence victims, prosecuting corrupt officials, and advocating for veterans wasn't a defensive recitation of credentials. It was an explanation of a worldview that saw leadership as an opportunity to protect and empower rather than to accumulate power and recognition. Most importantly, her calm dignity in the face of his attacks wasn't just media training or political skill. It was the natural response of someone who'd learned through experience. That personal attacks said more about the attacker than the target. Marcus realized that in attempting to diminish Patricia Whitmore, he'd actually revealed the limitations of his own perspective. He'd approached the interview from a position of privilege and comfort, using his platform to attack someone who'd spent decades fighting for people who had neither privilege nor comfort. The recognition was humbling in a way Marcus hadn't experienced since his early days in journalism, when he'd known how much he didn't know. Success and recognition had gradually insulated him from that kind of self-awareness, but Patricia's response had stripped away those protections and forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about both his methods and his motivations. Meanwhile, across the country, Patricia Whitmore was beginning her second day as a viral sensation, though she was far more focused on the work awaiting her at the Justice Department than on her newfound internet fame. Her schedule included briefings on ongoing investigations, meetings with department heads, and a conference call with federal prosecutors from around the country. But the interview's impact was evident even in these routine proceedings. During the prosecutor's conference call, several participants mentioned the interview and its effect on their own team's morale. Public defenders and victim advocates across the country had been energized by seeing someone from their world reach the highest levels of government while remaining true to the values that had brought them to public service in the first place. General Whitmore, said the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of California, "I want you to know that your words last night meant something to those of us who've chosen this work over more lucrative alternatives. Sometimes we need to be reminded that service is its own reward." Patricia was moved by the comment, but also concerned about the expectations it created. She didn't want to become a symbol that distracted from the actual work of running the Justice Department. Her goal wasn't to inspire people through her personal story, but to lead an organization that protected and served all Americans effectively. "I appreciate that," Patricia replied, "but I hope we can channel that energy into the work itself. The best way to honor public service is to do it well." After the call ended, Patricia reflected on the strange position she now found herself in. The interview had been intended to undermine her credibility, but its actual effect had been to elevate her profile and create expectations she wasn't sure she could meet. People were looking to her not just as an attorney general, but as a symbol of resilience and authentic leadership. The pressure was both flattering and concerning. Patricia had never sought to be anyone's inspiration or role model. She'd simply tried to do the right thing in whatever circumstances she'd found herself. Now she faced the challenge of living up to a public image that might constrain her ability to make the difficult, sometimes unpopular decisions that effective leadership required. That evening, Patricia called her daughter Emma to check in and process the day's events. Emma had been fielding media requests all day, but had declined most interviews, understanding instinctively that her mother's story was more powerful when it remained focused on principles rather than personalities. "How are you handling all this attention?" Emma asked. "I'm trying to remember that it's not really about me," Patricia replied. "People are responding to the idea that someone can reach this level while maintaining their values. My job is to prove that's actually possible." Emma smiled, recognizing the philosophy that had shaped her own approach to public defense work. "You know, watching that interview helped me understand something about my own work. When people ask me how I can represent clients that everyone else has given up on, I never know what to say. But you showed me last night. You don't defend the work by explaining it. You defend it by doing it with integrity." The conversation continued for another hour, with mother and daughter sharing insights about the strange intersection of public service and public attention. Both had chosen careers that required them to advocate for people who often couldn't advocate for themselves, and both had learned that such work demanded a kind of strength that was invisible until it was tested. As Patricia prepared for bed that night, she thought about the challenges ahead. The Attorney General position would require her to make decisions that affected millions of people, to navigate complex legal and political landscapes, to balance competing interests and priorities. Some of those decisions would be controversial, and some would inevitably draw criticism from people who had been inspired by her interview response. But the interview had also reminded Patricia of something important. Authenticity wasn't about being perfect or always making popular choices. It was about remaining true to your fundamental values, even when external pressures made it difficult to do so. The woman who had transformed Marcus Sterling's attack into an opportunity for authentic leadership was the same woman who would now have to prove that such leadership could be effective at the highest levels of government. The interview had been just the beginning of a much larger test, and Patricia understood that the real measure of her success wouldn't be found in viral videos or media coverage, but in the daily work of pursuing justice on behalf of all Americans. As sleep finally came, Patricia felt not the satisfaction of a battle won, but the quiet determination of someone preparing for the more difficult battles ahead. The interview had given her a platform and a voice, but now she had to use both, wisely in service of something far more important than her own reputation or legacy. 6 months after the interview that had redefined both their careers, Marcus Sterling found himself in an unexpected place, a community center in Detroit, watching Patricia Whitmore address a room full of formerly incarcerated individuals who were struggling to rebuild their lives. The transformation in both their circumstances would have seemed impossible on that March evening when their paths had first collided on live television. Marcus was no longer the host of primetime politics. The changes hadn't come suddenly or dramatically, but gradually, as both he and the network had recognized that his approach to journalism needed fundamental restructuring. Rather than face the humiliation of being demoted or replaced, Marcus had requested a reassignment that would allow him to develop a different kind of reporting style. His new role as a field correspondent focused on investigative pieces about social justice issues, stories that required him to spend weeks or months understanding complex problems rather than attempting to resolve them in 8-minute television segments. The work paid less and carried far less prestige, but it had given Marcus something he hadn't realized he'd been missing: the opportunity to actually understand the stories he was telling. The Detroit Community Center represented his latest assignment, a deep dive into re-entry programs for formerly incarcerated individuals. Marcus had spent 3 weeks interviewing program participants, social workers, and family members, gradually building a comprehensive picture of the challenges facing people trying to rebuild their lives after serving time in prison. What he hadn't expected was to encounter Patricia Whitmore at the center, speaking to a group of men and women about the Justice Department's new initiatives to support successful re-entry. She wasn't there for a photo opportunity or a policy announcement. She was there because she'd made a personal commitment to visit programs like this one every month, listening to first-hand accounts of what worked and what didn't in the criminal justice system. Marcus recognized immediately that this wasn't the same woman he'd interviewed 6 months earlier, though the core strength and authenticity remained unchanged. The Patricia Whitmore speaking to the Detroit group carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had not just survived political baptism by fire, but had used it as a foundation for meaningful reform. During her 6 months as Attorney General, Patricia had implemented changes that had surprised both her supporters and critics. Rather than focusing on high-profile prosecutions or political battles, she had quietly restructured how the Justice Department approached its core mission of ensuring equal justice under law. Her first major initiative had been the creation of community justice partnerships, programs that embedded federal prosecutors in local communities to work alongside public defenders, social workers, and community organizations. The approach was controversial among traditional law enforcement leaders who preferred maintaining clear boundaries between prosecution and defense, but early results suggested it was reducing both crime rates and incarceration rates in participating communities. Patricia had also established the Truth and Accountability Commission, a body tasked with reviewing cases where prosecutorial misconduct or inadequate defense representation might have led to wrongful convictions. The commission had already identified over 200 cases warranting further investigation, leading to 17 exonerations and dozens of sentence reductions. Most significantly, Patricia had used her platform to shift the national conversation about criminal justice from punishment to restoration. Her speeches and policy papers consistently emphasized that the goal of the justice system should be to heal communities and prevent future crimes, not simply to impose consequences for past actions. The approach had drawn criticism from politicians who preferred tough-on-crime rhetoric, but it had also garnered support from unexpected quarters. Police chiefs in several major cities had publicly endorsed Patricia's community partnership model, after seeing reductions in both crime and community tensions in their jurisdictions. As Marcus listened to Patricia address the Detroit group, he was struck by the evolution in her communication style. The defensive tone that had characterized her early interviews had been replaced by something far more confident and visionary. She spoke about criminal justice reform not as someone trying to prove her qualifications, but as someone who had already demonstrated her effectiveness through results. The question isn't whether people who've made mistakes deserve second chances, Patricia told the group. The question is whether we're smart enough to create systems that help people succeed when they get those chances. She described the new federal funding streams that would support job training programs, mental health services, and housing assistance for people re-entering society after incarceration. But more importantly, she spoke about these initiatives, not as government handouts, but as investments in community safety and economic development. When someone leaves prison with job skills, stable housing, and support systems in place, they don't just avoid committing new crimes, they become contributing members of their communities. They pay taxes, support local businesses, and often become mentors for others facing similar challenges. Marcus found himself taking notes not for his story, but because Patricia's words were reshaping his understanding of how social problems could be addressed. 6 months earlier, he would have approached criminal justice reform as a political issue, focusing on the electoral implications of being perceived as either tough on crime or soft on criminals. Now he was beginning to understand that the most important stories weren't about political positioning, but about practical solutions to human problems. The people in this room weren't statistics to be debated or policy abstractions to be analyzed. They were individuals whose success or failure would ripple outward to affect families, neighborhoods, and entire communities. After Patricia's presentation, Marcus approached her during the informal reception that followed. She recognized him immediately, and her expression carried neither hostility nor triumph, just the mild curiosity of someone encountering an unexpected acquaintance. "Marcus," she said, extending her hand, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I'm working on a series about re-entry programs," Marcus explained. "Your work keeps coming up in my interviews." Patricia smiled slightly. "I hope that's a good thing." "It is," Marcus said, and meant it. "The people I've been talking to, they speak about these programs like they've literally saved their lives. I wanted to understand what was different about your approach." They found a quiet corner where they could talk without being overheard. For the first time since their interview, Marcus felt like he was having a genuine conversation with Patricia, rather than conducting an interrogation or being subjected to political messaging. "The difference," Patricia said thoughtfully, "is that we're treating re-entry as a community issue rather than just a law enforcement issue. When someone comes out of prison, their success depends on having access to housing, employment, healthcare, and social support. Those aren't things the Justice Department typically provides, but they are things we can help coordinate." She described how the community justice partnerships were bringing together federal resources with local organizations to create comprehensive support systems. Former prosecutors were working alongside former public defenders to develop programs that addressed the root causes of criminal behavior rather than just its symptoms. "It sounds idealistic," Patricia acknowledged, "but the data is encouraging. Communities that have implemented these partnerships are seeing significant reductions in recidivism rates, and participants in the programs are achieving employment and housing stability at much higher rates than the national average." Marcus asked about the political challenges of implementing such programs, expecting to hear about legislative battles and bureaucratic obstacles. Instead, Patricia spoke about the difficulty of changing institutional cultures and long-established ways of thinking about justice. "The biggest challenge isn't funding or legal authority," she said. "It's convincing people that prevention is more effective than punishment, that investing in someone's success costs less than managing their failure. We've built our entire criminal justice system around the assumption that people can't change. But the evidence shows that with the right support, most people not only can change, but want to change." And as their conversation continued, Marcus found himself thinking about his own assumptions and biases. 6 months earlier, he would have pressed Patricia about the political risks of appearing soft on crime or the potential for program participants to take advantage of government services. Now, those questions seemed not just irrelevant, but actively counterproductive to understanding what was actually happening in communities like Detroit. The shift in his perspective hadn't happened overnight. It had been the result of dozens of interviews with people whose lives had been affected by the criminal justice system, hours spent in courtrooms and community centers, and gradual recognition that the stories that mattered most weren't being told in television studios or political debates. Marcus had interviewed a grandmother who was raising her teenage grandson, while his father served a 10-year sentence for drug dealing. She'd spoken about the impossible choice between keeping her grandson in a neighborhood where drug dealing was one of the few available sources of income and moving to an area where they couldn't afford the rent. He'd talked to a former gang member who had started a construction company that employed other formerly incarcerated individuals, creating economic opportunities in a community where legitimate businesses had largely fled. The man's success had been made possible by a federal program that provided loan guarantees for businesses owned by people with criminal records. Most powerfully, Marcus had interviewed a woman whose son had been murdered in a gang shooting and who now worked with the Community Justice Partnership to provide conflict resolution services in her neighborhood. Her transformation from victim to advocate had illustrated the difference between justice as revenge and justice as healing. These conversations had forced Marcus to confront the limitations of his previous approach to journalism. By focusing on political implications and adversarial dynamics, he'd missed the human stories that actually explained how social problems developed and how they might be solved. Patricia's programs weren't succeeding because they were politically popular or because they had eliminated all risks and challenges. They were succeeding because they were based on a fundamentally different understanding of what justice meant and what it could accomplish. As the evening wound down, Marcus found himself asking Patricia a question that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. "Would you be willing to let me shadow you for a few days? Not for an interview or a profile piece, but to understand how you approach this work? I'm trying to learn how to tell these stories better." Patricia considered the request carefully. She'd grown wary of media attention since becoming Attorney General, understanding that journalists often approached her work with predetermined narratives that didn't match the complex realities she was navigating. "What kind of story are you trying to tell?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet," Marcus admitted. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. 6 months ago, I thought I understood how journalism worked, how leadership worked, how change happened. Everything I've seen since then suggests I was wrong about most of it." The honesty in his response surprised Patricia. She'd grown accustomed to media requests that came with clear agendas and specific angles. Marcus seemed to be offering something different, genuine curiosity about her work, rather than predetermined conclusions about her motivations. "All right," she said finally, "but I want to be clear about the ground rules. You'll see everything I do: meetings, site visits, phone calls, decision-making processes, but the focus has to be on the work itself, not on me personally. The moment this becomes about personalities or politics instead of policy and results, our arrangement ends." Marcus agreed immediately, recognizing that Patricia was offering him the kind of access that could transform his understanding of how government actually functioned at its best. Over the following 2 weeks, Marcus accompanied Patricia to juvenile detention centers, where she was implementing restorative justice programs, federal courthouses where she was training prosecutors in trauma-informed practices, and community organizations where she was learning about local needs and priorities. What struck Marcus most powerfully was Patricia's approach to listening. Rather than arriving at meetings with predetermined agendas or talking points, she consistently began by asking questions and genuinely absorbing the answers before offering any responses or suggestions. In Oakland, she spent 3 hours listening to community leaders describe the impact of federal drug prosecutions on their neighborhoods. Instead of defending existing policies or dismissing their concerns, Patricia took detailed notes and asked follow-up questions that demonstrated her understanding of the complex dynamics they were describing. In Phoenix, she met with police, chiefs who were skeptical of her community partnership model. Rather than lecturing them about the benefits of her approach, she asked them to describe their current challenges and then explored whether any of her initiatives might address those specific problems. In Atlanta, she visited a federal prison where she was implementing educational and job training programs. Instead of conducting a ceremonial tour, she spent hours talking individually with inmates about their experiences and their plans for re-entry. Throughout these visits, Marcus observed a leadership style that was fundamentally different from anything he'd encountered in political journalism. Patricia wasn't trying to convince anyone of anything or to advance a particular narrative about her own effectiveness. She was simply trying to understand complex problems clearly enough to develop effective solutions. The approach produced remarkable results. Community leaders who had initially been suspicious of federal involvement became advocates for her programs. Police chiefs who had worried about appearing soft on crime began requesting resources to implement community partnerships in their own jurisdictions. Even prison administrators, traditionally resistant to reform initiatives, started volunteering their facilities as pilot sites for new programs. Marcus began to understand that Patricia's effectiveness came not from political savvy or bureaucratic maneuvering, but from a fundamental commitment to evidence-based decision-making and genuine collaboration with stakeholders. More importantly, he began to recognize that his own previous approach to journalism had been counterproductive to understanding how positive change actually happened. By focusing on conflict and controversy, he'd missed the careful, collaborative work that preceded most meaningful reforms. The transformation in Marcus's perspective became clear during a meeting in Baltimore, where Patricia was discussing gang violence prevention with community leaders. 6 months earlier, Marcus would have been looking for adversarial moments, policy, disagreements, or political implications that could drive a compelling television segment. Instead, he found himself fascinated by the process of consensus building, the way Patricia gradually helped diverse stakeholders identify shared goals and collaborative strategies. The meeting produced concrete commitments for new funding streams, revised prosecution priorities, and coordinated community programming, but it did so through patient negotiation rather than dramatic confrontation. As Marcus's time shadowing Patricia drew to a close, he realized that his entire understanding of leadership and public service had been fundamentally altered. The woman he'd attempted to humiliate 6 months earlier had taught him more about effective governance and authentic journalism than he'd learned in his previous 12 years of television reporting. On his final day with Patricia, Marcus asked her about the interview that had brought them together. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked. Patricia paused in reviewing briefing materials for her next meeting. "I think about it every day," she said, "not because it was particularly pleasant, but because it clarified something important for me, which was that the choice isn't between being attacked and being defended. The choice is between responding to attacks by defending yourself or responding by demonstrating who you actually are. Most political figures choose defense because it feels safer, but demonstration is almost always more effective." Marcus nodded, understanding that Patricia was describing not just a communication strategy, but a fundamental approach to leadership under pressure. "That night, you forced me to articulate what I believed and why I believed it," Patricia continued. "In a strange way, that prepared me for this job better than any confirmation hearing or policy briefing could have." She looked up from her papers. "What about you? Do you think about it?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Every day, but probably for different reasons. That interview taught me that I'd been approaching journalism backwards. I was so focused on exposing weaknesses that I'd forgotten the point was supposed to be illuminating strengths." Patricia smiled, Maybe that's the real lesson. The best way to test someone's character isn't to attack their vulnerabilities. It's to create opportunities for them to demonstrate their values under pressure. That afternoon, Marcus filed his final story about Patricia's work as attorney general. It was unlike anything he'd written before, focused not on political implications or personality profiles, but on the practical mechanics of criminal justice reform and its measurable impacts on communities across the country. The story described specific programs and their outcomes, quoted community leaders and program participants about their experiences, and provided detailed analysis of policy innovations that could be replicated in other jurisdictions. It was journalism as education rather than entertainment, information rather than investigation. The response to Marcus's reporting surprised him. Rather than generating the immediate viral engagement that characterized his previous work, the stories built audiences gradually as readers shared them with others who could benefit from the information they contained. Social workers forwarded articles to colleagues working on similar issues. Community leaders used the stories to support funding requests for local programs. Policy researchers cited Marcus's reporting in academic papers and legislative testimony. For the first time in his career, Marcus felt like his journalism was contributing to solutions rather than just highlighting problems. The recognition was both humbling and energizing, suggesting possibilities for media engagement that he'd never previously considered. 6 months after shadowing Patricia, Marcus received an unexpected phone call. Sarah Chen, his former executive at CNN, was starting a new non-profit journalism organization focused on solutions-oriented reporting about social issues. She wanted Marcus to lead their criminal justice coverage. "Your reporting on the Attorney General's programs has been exactly the kind of journalism we want to support," Sarah explained. "You've shown that it's possible to cover policy issues thoroughly without sensationalizing them or reducing them to political talking points." The opportunity would mean leaving television entirely and accepting a significant pay cut, but it would also allow Marcus to continue developing the reporting style he'd discovered while following Patricia's work. More importantly, it would connect his journalism directly to efforts to solve the problems he was investigating. Marcus accepted the position immediately, understanding that his career had found a new direction that was both professionally fulfilling and personally meaningful. The man who had once built his reputation on aggressive interviewing techniques was now becoming known for collaborative reporting that helped readers understand complex issues and identify effective responses to them. Meanwhile, Patricia's work as Attorney General continued to generate both praise and criticism, though the balance had shifted significantly in her favor as the results of her programs became increasingly apparent. Crime rates were declining. In communities that had implemented community justice partnerships, recidivism rates were dropping among participants in federal re-entry programs. Public trust in law enforcement was increasing in jurisdictions where prosecutors and community organizations were working collaboratively. More importantly, Patricia had succeeded in shifting the national conversation about criminal justice. From punishment and deterrence to restoration and prevention, politicians from both parties were beginning to adopt her language about healing communities and addressing root causes of crime. The transformation wasn't complete or universal. Traditional law enforcement organizations continued to resist some of her reforms, and conservative politicians still criticized her approach as insufficiently tough on crime. But the momentum was clearly in favor of the evidence-based, community-centered approach that Patricia had championed. On the first anniversary of their infamous interview, both Patricia and Marcus found themselves back in television studios, but in very different circumstances. Patricia was appearing on a panel discussion about criminal justice reform, while Marcus was being interviewed about his transition from television host to non-profit journalist. The contrast with their original encounter was striking. Where their first meeting had been adversarial and confrontational, their anniversary appearances were collaborative and constructive. Both had used the lessons from that initial collision to develop more effective approaches to their respective roles in public life. When asked about the interview that had changed both their careers, Patricia offered a reflection that surprised many viewers. "The most important thing about that night wasn't what happened to me or Marcus individually," she said. "It was what it demonstrated about the possibility for public discourse that goes beyond attack and defense to actual understanding and growth." Marcus, appearing on a different program, echoed similar themes. "The interview taught me that the most interesting stories aren't about conflict. They're about how people respond to conflict." Patricia Whitmore showed that it's possible to encounter hostility with grace, to respond to attacks by demonstrating character rather than defending positions. Both appearances generated significant social media engagement, but the tone was markedly different from the viral response to their original encounter. Instead of clips focused on confrontation and comeuppance, viewers were sharing longer segments that explored the substance of criminal justice reform and the evolution of political journalism. The anniversary also prompted reflection from other public figures who had watched their careers evolve over the previous year. Politicians began adopting Patricia's communication strategies, responding to hostile questions by demonstrating their values rather than simply defending their records. Journalists started experimenting with Marcus's collaborative approach, seeking to understand and illuminate rather than simply expose and critique. Most significantly, the interview's legacy could be seen in the concrete policy changes that had followed Patricia's rise to national prominence. Criminal justice reform initiatives modeled on her community justice partnerships had been implemented in over 100 communities. Federal funding for re-entry programs had increased dramatically, with bipartisan congressional support for legislation that prioritized evidence-based interventions over purely punitive approaches. The impact extended beyond criminal justice to other areas of public policy. Patricia's approach to stakeholder engagement and evidence-based decision-making was being adopted by other federal agencies working on issues ranging from education to healthcare to environmental protection. As the second anniversary of the interview approached, Patricia announced that she would be stepping down as Attorney General to establish the Center for Justice Innovation, a non-partisan organization focused on developing and implementing criminal justice reforms at the state and local level. The decision surprised many observers who expected her to use her position as a launching pad for higher office. But Patricia had concluded that she could have greater long-term impact by working directly with communities rather than managing federal bureaucracy. "The most important work in criminal justice reform happens at the local level," she explained during her resignation announcement. "Federal leadership can create opportunities and provide resources, but real change happens when communities take ownership of solutions that address their specific needs and priorities." The Center for Justice Innovation would provide technical assistance to communities implementing reform initiatives, conduct research on effective interventions, and train local leaders in evidence-based approaches to crime prevention and community healing. Marcus had been asked to serve as the center's director of communications, a role that would allow him to continue developing solutions-oriented journalism while supporting practical reform efforts. The position represented the complete transformation of his career from adversarial interviewer to collaborative advocate for systemic change. On the final day of Patricia's tenure as Attorney General, she hosted a reception for the community leaders, program participants, and advocacy organizations that had shaped her approach to the job. The event was held not in a government building, but in the same Detroit Community Center where Marcus had first encountered her work in action. The symbolism was intentional. Patricia wanted her farewell to federal service to emphasize the community-centered values that had guided her leadership rather than the Washington institutions where that leadership had been exercised. As the reception concluded, Patricia and Marcus found themselves in conversation for what might be the last time in their official capacities. Both recognized that their unexpected collision 2 years earlier had set in motion changes that extended far beyond their individual careers. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that interview had gone differently? Marcus asked. Patricia considered the question seriously. I think about it sometimes. If you'd been less aggressive, I might have given more conventional answers. If I'd been more defensive, the conversation might have devolved into typical political theater. She paused, watching community members and program participants sharing stories and making connections across the room. But I've come to believe that the specific words we said mattered less than what we both learned from the experience. You learned that journalism could be about building understanding rather than winning arguments. I learned that leadership under pressure requires authenticity rather than calculation. Marcus nodded. The interview was adversarial, but the outcome was collaborative. Maybe that's a model for how public discourse could work more generally. As they prepared to leave the community center, both understood that their paths would continue to intersect as they worked toward shared goals through different institutions and platforms. The hostility that had characterized their first encounter had evolved into mutual respect and collaborative partnership. The transformation of their relationship reflected broader changes in how public figures approached conflict and criticism. Rather than treating disagreement as a zero-sum competition, leaders across various fields were beginning to experiment with Patricia's model of responding to attacks by demonstrating character and Marcus's approach of seeking understanding rather than advantage. Years later, when political scientists and communication scholars studied the early decades of the 21st century, they would identify the Sterling Whitmore interview as a turning point in American public discourse. Not because it was the first time someone had responded to media hostility with grace and dignity, but because it had been broadcast widely enough to demonstrate the effectiveness of such responses to millions of viewers simultaneously. The interview had shown that political communication could transcend the attack and defend dynamics that had dominated public life for decades. More importantly, it had proved that authenticity and vulnerability could be more powerful than conventional political calculation and media manipulation. The impact was measurable not just in polling data or electoral outcomes, but in the concrete policy changes that had improved millions of lives across the country. Communities that had implemented Patricia's criminal justice reforms were safer and more prosperous. Journalism organizations that had adopted Marcus's collaborative approach were producing more informative and constructive coverage of complex social issues. Most significantly, the interview had inspired a generation of public servants and media professionals to approach their work differently. Young lawyers were choosing careers in public defense and community advocacy. Journalism students were developing skills in solutions-oriented reporting and collaborative investigation. As Patricia established the Center for Justice Innovation and Marcus expanded his non-profit journalism work, both continued to reference the lessons from their original encounter. But they spoke about it not as a personal triumph or professional breakthrough, but as an example of how unexpected moments of conflict could become opportunities for growth and positive change. The woman who had transformed a hostile interview into a demonstration of authentic leadership, and the man who had learned to practice journalism as a tool for understanding rather than exposure, had together created a new model for public engagement. They prioritized solutions over spectacle, collaboration over conflict, and long-term impact over immediate attention. Their story became a reminder that the most meaningful changes in public life often began not with grand gestures or planned campaigns, but with individual decisions to respond to difficult moments with integrity, curiosity, and commitment to something larger than personal advancement or professional success. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.